I was standing in the mahogany-paneled conference room when the lawyer slid that slim manila folder across the polished table toward my daughter, and in that single motion, so casual, so final, 50 years of my life dissolved like sugar in rain. Sarah didn't even glance at me. She reached for it with those perfectly manicured nails, the ones I'd paid for last Christmas, and beside her that boyfriend of hers, Marcus, with his slicked-back hair and designer watch, smirked like he'd just won the lottery. And I suppose in their minds they had. You know, I'm 83 years old now, and I've learned that the worst betrayals don't announce themselves with shouting or broken dishes. They arrive in whispers, in averted eyes, in the cold absence of a daughter's hand reaching for yours when the lawyer says your husband of 52 years left you almost nothing. Let me take you back a bit, because you need to understand how I got to that room. To that moment when my own child looked right through me as if I were already a ghost. My name is Margaret Whitmore, though Robert always called me Maggie, said it suited me better than something so formal. Robert. Even now, 6 months after we buried him, I reach for his coffee mug in the morning before I remember. We built everything together, you see. Everything. And I do mean we, not in that polite way wives said it back in my day, when they really meant their husbands did the work. Robert had the vision, certainly, but I had the grit, the stubbornness, the willingness to scrub floors at 3 in the morning when the cleaning crew didn't show up before an open house. We started with nothing in 1968. Well, not quite nothing. We had $1,000 Robert won in a poker game, and my inheritance from my mother, $12,000 that was supposed to be my security. I can still see the look on the bank officer's face when I told him I wanted to withdraw it all to buy a rundown duplex in what was then the worst neighborhood in Riverside. He actually asked if my husband knew what I was doing with my money. I signed those papers with my hand shaking, not from fear, but from excitement. We were 23 years old, and convinced we could flip that property in 6 months. It took us 14 months, and we nearly lost everything twice. But we didn't lose it. We painted every wall ourselves, replaced the plumbing with Robert watching YouTube videos before YouTube existed. We had library books and a retired plumber named Danny who felt sorry for us. I planted flowers in the front yard because Robert said curb appeal mattered. And I burned my arms in the sun until they blistered, wearing my mother's old gardening gloves that had holes in the fingers. When we finally sold that duplex, we made $19,000 profit. Robert cried. Actually cried, sitting on the floor of our tiny apartment with the check in his hands. We did it again. And again. Each property a little bigger, a little riskier, a little more rewarding. I kept the books balanced, negotiated with contractors who tried to overcharge us, learned to spot water damage and foundation issues just by the feel of a floor beneath my feet. Robert had the charm, the ability to walk into a room and make people believe in his vision of what a crumbling warehouse could become. Together, we were unstoppable. Sarah was born in 1973, right in the middle of our third renovation project, a small apartment building that needed everything replaced from the roof down. I went into labor while arguing with an electrician about his invoice, and Robert drove me to the hospital with paint still under his fingernails. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, a shock of dark hair like Robert's, and lungs that could wake the dead. I thought my heart would burst from loving her. The first few years were hard in ways I don't think young mothers today would understand. We couldn't afford daycare, so Sarah came to work sites with us. I'd set up a playpen in the corner of whatever room we were renovating, and she'd watch us work, gurgling and laughing at the sound of hammers and drills. When she got older, maybe 4 or 5, she'd hand Robert nails and pretend to measure things with a toy tape measure. She loved being part of it then. Or maybe I just wanted to believe she did. By the time Sarah was in middle school, we'd built something real. Not just a business, but an empire, though that word feels too grand, too cold. We owned 17 properties by then, apartment buildings, commercial spaces, a small shopping center. We still worked 70, 80 hours a week, but we could afford to send Sarah to private school, to give her piano lessons, to buy her the kind of clothes the other wealthy girls wore. I suppose that's where I made my first mistake. I wanted her to have what I never had, ease, security, the freedom to choose her path without desperation nipping at her heels. But I didn't realize that giving her everything meant she'd never understand the value of nothing, never know that terrifying, exhilarating feeling of risking it all and building something from dust and determination. She grew distant in high school. Not in any dramatic way. No slammed doors or shouted arguments. Just a slow, steady pulling away, like a boat drifting from shore so gradually you don't notice until the gap is too wide to cross. She stopped coming to properties with us on weekends, said she had homework or plans with friends. She'd roll her eyes when Robert talked about a new acquisition at dinner, said we were obsessed, boring, old-fashioned. It hurt, but I told myself it was normal. Teenagers separate from their parents. That's healthy, necessary. She'd come back around. She went to USC on our dime. Full tuition, apartment, spending money, a car. Robert wanted to teach her about the business, have her intern with us during summers, but she refused. Said she wanted to find her own way, that she wasn't interested in landlord stuff. That word, landlord, she said it like it was something distasteful, something beneath her. As if the work that paid for her education, her lifestyle, her freedom, was somehow shameful. After college, she bounced between jobs. Marketing assistant, event coordinator, social media manager. Nothing stuck. She'd quit after 6 months, 8 months, always with some story about a toxic boss or an unappreciative company. We kept supporting her, first and last month's rent on apartments, car payments when hers broke down, credit card bills when she got in a little over her head. Robert always gave in. Said she was finding herself, that we should be patient. I was patient for 20 years. Then Marcus appeared 2 years ago, sliding into her life like oil into water. She brought him to Sunday dinner one evening. We still did those, though by then they felt more like obligation than connection. He was 41 to her 39, divorced twice, and he talked about investment opportunities and disrupting the real estate market, with the kind of smooth confidence that sets off alarm bells in anyone who's actually built something real. Robert was polite. I was quieter. After they left, I told Robert there was something off about Marcus, something performative in the way he complimented our home, asked too many questions about our portfolio. Robert squeezed my hand and said I was being overprotective, that Sarah was a grown woman who could make her own choices. But mothers know. We know in our bones when something is wrong, even if we can't articulate it, even if everyone tells us we're being paranoid or controlling. The changes in Sarah accelerated after that. She visited less often, and when she did come, Marcus was always with her, steering conversations, asking Robert about property values and trust structures. He called Robert Pops, which made my skin crawl. Robert had worked himself into the ground building our empire, and this smooth-talking stranger, who'd never hammered a nail in his life, was acting like they were buddies, partners, family. Then came Robert's diagnosis 18 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctor gave us 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment. Robert chose treatment, not because he thought it would save him, but because he wasn't ready to leave me. He said that one night after a particularly brutal round of chemo, lying in our bed with his head on my chest, his body so frail I was afraid to hold him too tight. I thought grief would bring Sarah closer. I thought watching her father fade would remind her of what mattered, shake her out of whatever selfishness had taken root in her heart. Instead, Marcus convinced her I was the problem. I started noticing the changes about 3 months into Robert's treatment. Small things at first that I tried to dismiss as stress, or my own paranoia wearing thin from exhaustion and fear. Sarah began visiting Robert alone, asking me to run errands during her scheduled times with him. She'd text me the night before. "Dad wants to see me tomorrow at 2. Could you maybe grab groceries then?" And like a fool, I'd agree, grateful she was making time for her dying father at all. I'd come home to find them in his study with the door closed. And when I'd knock softly to bring tea or medication, there'd be this heavy silence before Sarah would open the door just wide enough to take the tray from my hands. She never invited me in. Robert would look exhausted, sometimes confused, and when I'd ask later what they discussed, he'd wave his hand vaguely and say business stuff. Nothing for me to worry about. Nothing for me to worry about. After 52 years of worrying about every detail together, suddenly there were things I didn't need to know. Marcus started appearing more frequently too, always with his leather portfolio and expensive pen, talking about estate planning and tax optimization. He'd pat Robert's shoulder like they were old friends and suggest I might be more comfortable watching my shows in the living room while they talked numbers. The first time he said that, I should have planted my feet and refused to budge. But Robert was so weak by then, sleeping 16 hours a day, and I told myself that if discussing business gave him some sense of purpose, some distraction from the pain, then maybe it was a kindness to step aside. How do you grieve someone who's still breathing? That's what those months were. Anticipatory grief, they call it, though no clinical term can capture the specific torture of watching the man you built a life with disappear in increments. Some days Robert would be himself, sharp and funny, telling me stories I'd heard 1,000 times like they were fresh, reaching for my hand while we watched the sunset from our bedroom window. Other days the morphine would pull him under, and he'd surface confused, calling me by his mother's name, asking why the office was rearranged when we'd been home for weeks. The worst days were when he'd look at me with perfect clarity and apologize. For dying. For leaving me alone. For not being strong enough to fight harder. I'd hold his face in my hands and tell him he'd fought harder than any man I'd ever known. That he'd given me a beautiful life, that it was okay to rest. But inside I was screaming at God, at the universe, at the cancer cells multiplying in his body. Screaming that it wasn't fair, that we were supposed to grow old together, that I wasn't ready to learn how to be Margaret without Robert. Sarah brought papers one afternoon in November, for months before Robert died. I was in the kitchen making soup, the only thing Robert could keep down by then, when I heard voices from the study. Not just Robert and Sarah, but Marcus too, and another voice I didn't recognize. I turned off the stove and walked down the hallway, my heart starting that awful pounding that meant something was wrong. The study door was cracked open. Through the gap I could see Robert in his wheelchair, so thin the blanket over his lap looked like it was draped over bones instead of a man. Sarah stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder, and Marcus was talking to a stranger in a suit. A lawyer, I realized, from the briefcase and the formal way he gestured at documents spread across Robert's desk. I pushed the door open. All four of them turned to look at me, and the lawyer's expression shifted to something almost guilty, quickly masked by professional courtesy. What's going on? My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high, too uncertain. Just updating Dad's will, Sarah said smoothly, too smoothly. Making sure everything's in order, tax efficient. Marcus knows a great estate attorney. We have an estate attorney, I said. Gerald Morrison has handled our affairs for 30 years. Dad wanted a second opinion, Marcus interjected, that easy smile never reaching his eyes. Morrison's old school, doesn't understand modern trust structures. We're just protecting the legacy here, Maggie. The casual use of my nickname from his mouth felt like a violation. And Robert, my Robert, just sat there looking between us with foggy eyes, exhausted and confused, not confirming or denying anything. Robert? I moved toward him, needing to see his face to understand. What is this about? It's fine, Maggie, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Just tired. They're helping. They're helping. Those words would echo in my head for months afterward, during all the sleepless nights when I'd replay that moment and wonder what I could have done differently. I should have called our lawyer right then. Should have demanded to see those papers, to understand what was being signed. But Sarah gave me this look, this patient, pitying look, and said that I was stressing Dad out, that he needed rest, that we could discuss everything later when he was stronger. Except he never got stronger. He deteriorated rapidly after that day, as if signing those papers had released him somehow, given him permission to let go. The hospice nurse moved in during January. Robert stopped eating, stopped speaking in full sentences. I held his hand through the long nights, whispering memories into the darkness. Our first kiss, our wedding day, the morning Sarah was born, the day we sold our 100th property and danced in the office like teenagers. I don't know if he heard me. I hope he did. He died on a Tuesday morning in February, just as the sun was coming up. I was lying beside him in our bed, my head on his chest like I had for 5 decades, and I felt the moment his breathing stopped. No dramatic gasps or struggles. Just a gentle ceasing, like a clock winding down. One moment he was there, the next he was somewhere I couldn't follow. Sarah didn't cry at the funeral. That's what I remember most clearly from that awful day. standing at the graveside in my black dress, watching them lower my husband into the ground, and glancing over to see Sarah dry-eyed behind her designer sunglasses, Marcus's arm around her waist like he was holding her up when she showed no signs of falling. People commented on how strong she was being, how dignified. I wanted to scream that strength and numbness aren't the same thing. That dignified looks a lot like indifferent when your father's body is 6 feet under, and you're checking your phone. But I stayed silent. Swallowed my grief and my anger and my growing dread about those papers, those private meetings, those closed doors. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I assumed it would be at Gerald Morrison's office, with the lawyer who'd known us for 3 decades presiding over the distribution of assets Robert and I had built together. Instead, Sarah informed me via text that we'd be meeting at the office of Westfield and Associates, the firm that new lawyer worked for, the one I'd seen in Robert's study that November afternoon. I should have fought harder, should have insisted on our lawyer, our terms, our history being respected. But I was drowning in grief, barely able to get out of bed most mornings. And some broken part of me still believed that Sarah, my daughter, my only child, wouldn't hurt me when I was already shattered. That's the thing about betrayal by the people you love most. You can't see it coming because seeing it would require believing they're capable of it, and that belief is incompatible with the love itself. You stay blind because the alternative is too devastating to contemplate. So I put on my black dress again, drove myself to that downtown office building, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and walked into that mahogany-paneled conference room where my whole world would crack apart. Sarah was already there with Marcus, both of them dressed like they were attending a business merger instead of the final accounting of a dead man's legacy. They sat on one side of the table, close together, Marcus whispering something that made Sarah smile, actually smile, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The lawyer entered. Young, sleek, carrying that manila folder like it contained something routine instead of the dismantling of my entire life. And then he started reading, and the words didn't make sense at first, couldn't make sense, because surely Robert wouldn't have. Couldn't have. The lawyer's name was Jonathan Westfield, and he had the kind of voice that probably served him well in courtrooms, measured, unemotional, designed to convey information without the inconvenience of human feeling. He opened that folder and began reading, and at first I convinced myself I was misunderstanding. That grief had scrambled my ability to process language, because what he was saying couldn't possibly be what Robert had intended. The primary residence, our home, where Sarah took her first steps, where Robert and I had celebrated 50 anniversaries, went to Sarah. The beachfront property in Malibu, the one Robert bought for our 40th anniversary, the place where we'd planned to retire and watch the ocean until we were too old to walk to the shore, that went to Sarah too. The downtown commercial building that generated $2 million in rental income annually, the apartment complex in Beverly Hills, the resort properties in Palm Springs. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. My name appeared exactly once in the entire document. I was to receive a modest trust fund, $200,000 annually, and the right to remain in the primary residence for up to 1 year, after which Sarah, as the new owner, could determine my living arrangements. Like I was a tenant whose lease was up for review. The lawyer kept reading, but his voice had faded to a distant hum, drowned out by the roaring in my ears. Across the table, Sarah was nodding along like this was all perfectly reasonable, perfectly fair. Marcus had his hand on her thigh, possessive, triumphant. Neither of them looked at me. When Westfield finally finished and closed the folder, the silence in that room felt thick enough to choke on. I don't understand, I heard myself say, and my voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. This isn't. Robert wouldn't. I know this must be difficult, Mrs. Whitmore, Westfield said with practiced sympathy that meant nothing. But these were your husband's clear wishes, executed with full mental capacity and proper legal counsel. Mental capacity? The words burst out of me sharper than I intended. He was dying. He was on morphine. He barely knew what day it was half the time. Mother. Sarah spoke for the first time, and there was steel beneath the surface of that word, a warning. Dad was very clear about his intentions. He wanted to ensure the properties stayed in the family, protected from, she paused delicately, any future complications. Future complications. I stared at my daughter, at this woman I'd grown inside my body, nursed, raised, sacrificed for, and I didn't recognize her. Or maybe I was finally recognizing her for the first time. What complications? I asked quietly. What are you talking about? Marcus leaned forward then, his expensive cologne wafting across the table. Robert was concerned about your age, Maggie. About your ability to manage such a complex portfolio. He wanted Sarah to take over the business side of things, to preserve his legacy. My age. I was 67 years old, the same age Robert had been, and I'd been managing our complex portfolio since before Marcus was born. I'd negotiated million-dollar deals, navigated market crashes, turned failing properties into gold mines. But suddenly I was too old, too incompetent, too much of a risk. He discussed this with you? I looked at Sarah, needing to understand. Your father talked to you about cutting me out? Something flickered in her eyes. Guilt maybe, or discomfort, but it vanished quickly. He wanted to protect what you'd built together. Make sure it stayed successful. You can still live in the house for a year, have your trust fund. You'll be comfortable. Comfortable. After 52 years of marriage, after building an empire from nothing, after nursing my husband through his final agonizing months, I would be comfortable. In my own home. For 1 year. If my daughter allowed it. I stood up then, my legs shaking but holding. I need copies of everything. All the documents Robert signed, dates, witnesses. Everything. Westfield's expression shifted slightly, a crack in that professional facade. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not sure that's everything, I repeated, and this time my voice didn't shake. I have that right. As his widow, I have the right to review any documents concerning his estate. He exchanged a glance with Sarah. She gave a tiny nod. Of course, he said smoothly. We'll have copies prepared for you by end of week. I walked out of that conference room without looking back at my daughter, rode the elevator down 14 floors with tears I refused to let fall burning behind my eyes, and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. The house felt different when I returned. Not mine anymore, not home. Just a place I was being allowed to occupy temporarily, like a guest who'd overstayed their welcome. I walked through rooms Robert and I had designed together, past photographs of our life, and felt like a ghost haunting my own history. That night I lay in our bed, my bed now, I suppose, though not for long, and tried to make sense of what had happened. Robert loved me. I knew he loved me. In all our years together, through every struggle and success, that was the one constant I'd never questioned. So how could he have done this? How could he have left me with nothing while giving everything to the daughter, who'd barely visited him in his final years? Unless he hadn't. The thought crept in slowly, reluctantly, because accepting it meant accepting something far worse than being forgotten by my dying husband. It meant accepting that Sarah, my only child, had orchestrated something unforgivable. Those private meetings. The closed doors. Marcus and his leather portfolio and expensive lawyer. Robert's confusion, his exhaustion, his morphine-fogged mind. The papers I'd seen spread across his desk. The guilty look on Westfield's face when I'd walked in. I got up and went to Robert's study, turned on the light, and started searching. His filing cabinets were still locked. I had keys, had always had keys, but suddenly I wondered if the locks had been changed. They hadn't. Inside I found folders organized exactly as we'd kept them for years, except for one drawer that was nearly empty. The drawer where we'd kept all our estate planning documents. I pulled out the single folder remaining, and inside found a copy of our actual will. The one Gerald Morrison had drafted 15 years ago. The one that left everything to both of us jointly, with Sarah as beneficiary only after we were both gone. The one that established me as executor of Robert's estate, an equal partner in every asset we owned. This will was dated 2010. The one Westfield had read was dated November 2024, 2 months after Robert's diagnosis, right around the time of those closed-door meetings. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone and called Gerald Morrison's office. It was after business hours, but Gerald had given me his personal number years ago, back when Robert and I were his biggest clients and closest friends. He answered on the third ring, surprised to hear from me so late. Gerald, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I need to know, did Robert ever contact you about changing his will? Silence on the other end, then careful words. No, Margaret. The last time I spoke with Robert was at your Christmas party in 2023. Why? I told him. All of it. The new will, the new lawyer, the reading where I'd discovered I was being evicted from my own life. Gerald listened without interrupting, and when I finished, his silence lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Margaret, he finally said, and his voice carried something I couldn't quite identify. Anger maybe, or determination. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. And tomorrow morning, first thing, you come to my office. Bring every document you have, every text message, every email. We're going to look at this very carefully. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in Robert's chair in his study, surrounded by the empire we'd built together, and began gathering evidence. Texts from Sarah asking me to leave during her visits with Robert. Emails from Marcus about streamlining the estate. Photos I'd taken of Robert in his final months, documenting his deteriorating condition, his confusion, the medications that kept him sedated and compliant. And I found something else tucked in the back of one drawer. A manila envelope with my name on it in Robert's handwriting, shaky and barely legible but unmistakably his. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated 3 weeks before he died, during one of his brief moments of clarity. Maggie, it read. If you're reading this, something went wrong. I tried to tell you, but they're always there. Check the safety deposit box. Box 247. Only you have access. I made sure. Trust no one else. I love you. I'm sorry. R. I didn't wait until morning. At 5 a.m., still dark outside, I dressed in the same clothes from the day before, grabbed my keys and purse, and drove to the bank where Robert and I had maintained accounts for 40 years. The safety deposit box room didn't open until 9. I sat in my car in the parking lot as the sun rose, watching the city wake up around me, and tried to prepare myself for whatever Robert had hidden away. He'd been trying to warn me, even through the morphine fog, even with Sarah and Marcus circling like vultures. He'd found a way to leave me a message. I was the first customer through the doors when they opened. The bank manager, a woman named Patricia who'd known us for years, saw me and her professional smile faltered into something softer, more concerned. Mrs. Whitmore, she said quietly. I was so sorry to hear about Mr. Whitmore. He was a remarkable man. I thanked her, my voice mechanical, and asked to access box 247. She led me to the vault, used her key in conjunction with mine, and left me alone in one of the small private rooms with the metal box sitting on the table like Pandora's gift. Inside were documents. Dozens of them, carefully organized in manila folders labeled in Robert's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened the first one. It was a series of text messages printed out between Sarah and Marcus, dated from August through November of 2024, covering the months of Robert's decline. He's getting weaker. This is our window. Marcus. I can't. He's my father. Sarah. He's dying anyway. Would you rather let some hospice worker convince him to leave everything to charity? Or worse, let your mother remarry someday and give away your inheritance to some new husband? Marcus. She'd never. Sarah. She's only 67. She could live another 30 years. Find someone else. You really want to wait until you're 70 to get what should be yours now. Marcus. The messages continued, Marcus gradually eroding Sarah's resistance, playing on her fears and greed, painting me as a threat to her future security. And slowly, horribly, I watched my daughter agree to his plan. What do we need to do? Sarah. I know a lawyer. Someone who understands complex estates. We get your dad to sign a new will during one of his bad days. When he's confused. Your mom won't be there, make sure of that. After he's gone, she can contest it all she wants, but possession is 9/10 of the law. Once you've taken control of the properties, sold a few, distributed the assets, it'll be nearly impossible to reverse. Marcus. Nearly impossible. Not completely impossible. Marcus knew what they were doing was fraud, but he'd gambled that I wouldn't fight, that I'd be too grief-stricken or too intimidated or too old to mount a real challenge. The next folder contained medical records. I recognized Dr. Chen's letterhead, Robert's oncologist. But these weren't the records I'd seen, the ones documenting his treatment plan and prognosis. These were dated from November, the month of those closed-door meetings, and they included detailed notes about Robert's cognitive state. Patient exhibiting significant confusion and disorientation, likely due to disease progression and pain medication regimen. Difficulty tracking conversations. Unable to reliably recall events from day to day. Would not recommend patient make significant legal or financial decisions without thorough review by trusted advisor and careful documentation of capacity evaluation. Dr. Chun. Robert's own doctor had documented that he wasn't capable of making informed legal decisions. Yet somehow Westfield had gotten him to sign a will completely restructuring his entire estate. A will that contradicted decades of careful planning with our actual attorney. The third folder made my blood run cold. It was a capacity evaluation, supposedly conducted by a psychiatrist named Dr. Raymond Foster, dated the same day as the will signing. According to this document, Dr. Foster had evaluated Robert and found him to be of sound mind and fully capable of understanding the nature and consequences of his testamentary decisions. But clipped to this evaluation was a handwritten note from Robert, barely legible. Never met this doctor. Man came with lawyer. Asked 3 questions. Whole thing 10 minutes. Signed paper saying I was confused, they changed it. They'd forged a capacity evaluation. Or manipulated one. Gotten a doctor, if he even was a real doctor, to rubber stamp Robert's competency after a 10-minute interview with a dying man on morphine, then potentially altered his findings to suit their purposes. I sat in that small room surrounded by evidence of my daughter's betrayal, and something inside me shifted. The grief was still there, the hurt that Sarah could do this, that Marcus could orchestrate it, that Robert had died knowing something was wrong but too weak to stop it. But alongside the grief was something harder, colder, more focused. Rage. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly. The steady, determined kind that calculates and plans and waits for exactly the right moment to strike. The final folder was thickest. Inside were copies of the original trust documents Robert and I had established in 1995, when Sarah was 22 and we'd first begun serious estate planning. I'd seen these before, or thought I had, but Robert had marked several pages with yellow highlighter and marginal notes. On page 47, tucked into a section about trust modifications and beneficiary disputes, was a clause I'd forgotten existed. We'd included it at Gerald Morrison's suggestion, back when we were younger and more paranoid about potential future complications. The reversion clause. It stated in careful legal language that if any beneficiary was found to have engaged in fraud, undue influence, or coercion regarding the trust or estate assets, all transferred properties would immediately revert to the original trustee, me, with the perpetrator liable for treble damages and all legal costs. Robert had circled this clause multiple times in red ink. In the margin he'd written, "They don't know this exists. The new will doesn't supersede the trust. Trust controls everything. Trust officer is James Chun, call him. He knows." James Chun, Dr. Chen's brother, a trust attorney who'd helped us establish our family trust 30 years ago. I'd forgotten about him. He'd moved to San Francisco years ago to head a wealth management firm. But apparently Robert hadn't forgotten. I gathered every document, every folder, every piece of evidence Robert had left me, and drove straight to Gerald Morrison's office. He was waiting for me, had cleared his entire morning schedule. When I spread those documents across his conference table, Gerald's face went from concerned to furious in the space of 30 seconds. "This is textbook elder abuse," he said quietly, picking up the forged capacity evaluation. "Undue influence. Possible fraud. Margaret, with what Robert left you here, we don't just contest the will. We destroy it. And everyone involved." "How long?" I asked. "How long before we can act? We need to be strategic." Gerald pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "First, we contact James Chun, get confirmation that the trust provisions are still active. Second, we get our own expert to review these medical records and capacity evaluation. Third, we file for a forensic audit of any property transactions Sarah's made since Robert's death. If she's sold anything or taken loans against the properties, that strengthens our case for irreparable harm. She has sold things, I said, remembering the Instagram posts I'd been torturing myself with over the past 2 weeks. Sarah posing in front of the Malibu property with a sold sign. Sarah celebrating at some exclusive club. Marcus beside her with his arm around a bottle of $1,000 champagne. At least one property. Maybe more. Gerald's smile was grim. Perfect. She's liquidating assets that don't legally belong to her. Every transaction she makes digs her hole deeper. How long before she realizes something's wrong? I asked. The trust requires an annual audit, conducted by an independent trustee. That's James Chun. The next scheduled audit is. He pulled up something on his computer. 3 weeks from today. She'll receive a notice that it's mandatory, that all beneficiaries must attend. That's when we lower the hammer. 3 weeks. 21 days to watch my daughter celebrate her betrayal. To stay silent while she gutted the empire Robert and I built. To pretend I was defeated and broken while I gathered allies and evidence. I could do that. After 52 years of hard work, of early mornings and late nights, of fighting for every success, I could do 3 more weeks. Gerald, I said, looking at the man who'd been our friend and advisor for 3 decades. I want everything. Not just the properties back. I want Sarah to face consequences. Real consequences. What she did to her dying father, what she tried to do to me. I want her to understand exactly what she's lost. He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll make the calls. We'll build the case. And Margaret? Robert would be proud of you. The hardest thing I've ever done wasn't building a business from nothing, or nursing my husband through cancer, or even sitting in that conference room while my daughter destroyed my life. The hardest thing was the 3 weeks that followed, watching Sarah dismantle everything Robert and I created while I smiled and stayed silent, and let her believe she'd won. She called me 2 days after the will reading, her voice bright and cheerful like we were just catching up, like she hadn't just stolen my entire world. Mom, I wanted to talk about the house situation, she said. I know the will gives you a year, but Marcus and I have been thinking. Wouldn't you be more comfortable somewhere smaller? Easier to maintain? There's a lovely assisted living community in Pasadena, very upscale. And with your trust fund you could easily afford. I'm 67, Sarah, I interrupted quietly. Not 97. I don't need assisted living. A pause, then that patient tone that made my skin crawl. Of course not. I just meant, the house is so big, and you're all alone now, and we were thinking we might move in, help you with maintenance, make sure you're not lonely. Move in. Take over. Push me into a corner of my own home until I got tired of being a guest and left voluntarily, saving her the trouble of evicting me when the year was up. I'll think about it, I lied. I need some time to process everything. Sure, Mom. Take your time. Then, almost as an afterthought. Oh, and I sold the Malibu property. It was just sitting there, and the market's hot right now. Marcus found a buyer who paid $3 million over asking. Can you believe it? I could believe it. That property was worth $15 million easily. If someone paid 18 for it, they got the deal of the century. But Sarah wouldn't know that, wouldn't understand property valuation the way Robert and I did. The way you only learn through decades of experience. Marcus had probably pocketed a kickback from the buyer, convinced Sarah she'd gotten a great deal when really she'd been played. That's wonderful, honey, I said, and the endearment tasted like ash in my mouth. She called every few days after that, always with updates about properties she was selling or plans she was making. The downtown commercial building, sold to a development company for $30 million, $20 million under its actual value. The Beverly Hills apartments, refinanced with a predatory loan that gave them $5 million in cash, but would cost them twice that in interest over time. The Palm Springs Resort. Under contract, she said proudly, though she wouldn't tell me the price. I listened and made appropriate noises and died a little with each phone call. Gerald had advised me to let her keep going. Let her make mistake after mistake. Let her prove to the court exactly how unqualified she was to manage the empire she'd stolen. But it hurt. God, it hurt watching her destroy what Robert and I had spent 50 years building. Marcus posted constantly on social media. I'd created a fake account just to monitor them, something Gerald had suggested for documentation purposes. Photos of luxury cars, designer shopping bags, exclusive restaurants. Sarah beside him in every shot, draped in expensive clothes, her smile wide and empty. They looked like lottery winners, like people who'd stumbled into wealth without earning it, without understanding its weight or responsibility. One photo in particular haunted me. They were on a yacht. Not one of ours, rented probably, another wasteful expense. And Sarah was holding a champagne glass, toasting the camera. The caption read, "To new beginnings and endless possibilities. Dad would be so proud. Dad would be so proud." Of her betraying me? Of her forging documents while he lay dying? Of her dismantling his legacy for quick cash and Instagram photos? I sat in Robert's study that night, in his chair, surrounded by memories of late nights spent planning and dreaming and building, and I let myself cry for the first time since his funeral. Not gentle tears, but the ugly, gasping kind that come from somewhere deep and primal. I cried for Robert, for the daughter I'd lost long before she betrayed me, for the naive woman I'd been who thought love and sacrifice were enough to bind a family together. When the tears finally stopped, I was empty but clear-headed. Grief is a strange thing. It comes in waves, drowning you when you least expect it, but each time you surface, you're a little stronger, a little more ready to face what comes next. Gerald called twice a week with updates. James Chun had confirmed that the trust was still active, and that the reversion clause was ironclad. Any legal challenge to it would fail. The forensic accountant had started documenting Sarah's transactions, building a timeline of financial mismanagement and asset depletion. Dr. Martinez, a psychiatrist who specialized in capacity evaluations, had reviewed Robert's medical records and written a scathing report about the impossibility of the evaluation Dr. Foster had supposedly conducted. "We have her," Gerald said during one call. "6 ways from Sunday, we have her. The question is how hard you want to push." "What are my options?" I asked. Option 1, we present the evidence at the audit, trigger the reversion clause, get the properties back, and walk away. Sarah loses everything but faces no criminal charges. Option 2, we pursue fraud charges. Elder abuse. Forgery. She could face prison time, Margaret. Real prison time, not white-collar tennis camp. And Marcus definitely would. Prison. My daughter behind bars, wearing orange, living in a cell. Part of me, the part that remembered her as a baby, as a little girl handing Robert nails at construction sites, recoiled from the thought. But another part, the part that had watched her smile while destroying her father's legacy, felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "Let me think about it," I said. But I was already thinking about it, turning it over in my mind during the long sleepless nights, weighing justice against mercy, punishment against forgiveness. Sarah invited me to lunch 2 weeks into the waiting period. We met at an upscale restaurant in Beverly Hills, the kind of place where lunch costs more than most people's mortgage payment. She was late, arrived in a chauffeured car wearing a dress I recognized from a fashion show I'd seen online. $30,000, the price tag said. She'd bought it with money from selling my properties. "Mom, you look tired," she said, kissing my cheek like we were friends meeting for a casual meal. "Are you sleeping okay?" "Well enough," I lied. She ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted, then launched into a monologue about her plans. She and Marcus were thinking about buying a place in the Hamptons, maybe getting a pied-a-terre in Manhattan, investing in some cryptocurrency venture Marcus was excited about. "The money Dad left me, it's like he knew I'd know what to do with it," she said, sipping her $100 wine. "How to make it grow, build something bigger." I watched her across the table, this stranger wearing my daughter's face, and wondered when exactly I'd lost her. Had it been gradual, a slow erosion of empathy and gratitude? Or had there been a specific moment, a turning point where she'd looked at me and decided I was no longer a person who deserved respect, just an obstacle between her and what she wanted? "Your father and I built that empire from nothing," I said quietly. "We risked everything. Lost sleep. Sacrificed years of our lives. It wasn't just money to us. It was proof that we could create something meaningful, something lasting." Sarah's expression flickered. Guilt maybe, or irritation, but she recovered quickly. I know, Mom. And I'm honoring that by taking care of what you built. Making sure it stays profitable. By selling it off piece by piece? By liquidating underperforming assets and reinvesting in better opportunities. She said it like she was reciting something Marcus had told her. Words she didn't fully understand but sounded sophisticated. Dad would want the portfolio optimized. Your father wanted you to have integrity, I thought but didn't say. He wanted you to earn things, to understand sacrifice, to be someone worthy of inheriting his legacy. Instead, I smiled and changed the subject, asked about her plans for the weekend, complimented her dress, let her think I was defeated, resigned, too old and tired to fight. The lunch ended with Sarah promising to help me find someplace comfortable, to live once my year in the house was up. She hugged me goodbye, and I felt nothing, not love, not anger, just a vast emptiness where my daughter used to be. 3 days before the audit, Gerald called with final preparations. James Chin will conduct the meeting at his firm's conference room in San Francisco. Sarah will receive official notice tomorrow that her presence is mandatory. She'll probably bring Marcus. Maybe Westfield too if she's nervous. And then we show her everything. The texts, the medical records, the forged evaluation. Chin will invoke the reversion clause, and every property transfers back to you immediately. After that, it's your choice whether we pursue criminal charges. The conference room in San Francisco was on the 42nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. I arrived 30 minutes early with Gerald, both of us carrying briefcases full of evidence, documentation, proof of every lie Sarah had told and every document she'd forged. James Chin was already there, older now than I remembered but still sharp-eyed and meticulous. He'd known Robert since the early days, had helped us structure our first real trust when we finally had enough assets to warrant the complexity. He shook my hand with both of his, and I saw real grief in his face. Robert called me 2 weeks before he died. James said quietly, during one of his clear moments. He was terrified, Margaret. Said something was wrong but he couldn't prove it, couldn't stop it. He made me promise to enforce every provision of the trust to the letter. No exceptions, no mercy. Those were his exact words, no mercy. We waited in silence, watching the clock. Sarah was due at 10. At 9:58, the receptionist buzzed to announce her arrival. She swept in wearing another expensive outfit, Marcus beside her in a $1,000 suit. And behind them was Jonathan Westfield carrying his own briefcase. Sarah's smile faltered slightly when she saw me sitting at the conference table, but she recovered quickly. Mom, I didn't know you'd be here, she said, and I caught the edge in her voice, the first hint of nervousness. Mrs. Whitmore is the trust's primary beneficiary and original trustee, James said calmly. Her presence is required for any audit. Sarah's eyes darted to Marcus, who gave her a subtle nod as they took seats across from us. Westfield sat at the end, looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested he might understand exactly how much trouble he was in. James opened the meeting with formalities. The purpose of the annual audit, the trust's provisions, the responsibilities of all parties. Sarah kept checking her phone, clearly wanting to be anywhere else, probably thinking this was just bureaucratic nonsense she had to endure before getting back to her spending spree. Then James's tone shifted. Before we proceed with the standard financial review, he said, there are some irregularities that must be addressed. Specifically, concerns have been raised about the circumstances surrounding Robert Whitmore's final will and testament, signed November 15, 2024. Sarah's head snapped up. Marcus went very still. What concerns? Westfield asked, his lawyer voice activated but not quite hiding his unease. James slid a folder across the table. These concerns. For the next 20 minutes, James methodically presented every piece of evidence Robert had left in that safety deposit box. The text messages between Sarah and Marcus, planning their scheme. The medical records documenting Robert's incapacity. The notes about the forged capacity evaluation. The timeline showing Sarah had systematically isolated Robert during his weakest moments. I watched my daughter's face as the truth unfolded. The color drained from her cheeks. Her hands started trembling. Beside her, Marcus had gone pale, his smooth confidence evaporating like morning fog. This isn't, Sarah stammered. We didn't. You forged a capacity evaluation, Gerald cut in, his voice hard. You manipulated a dying man into signing documents he didn't understand. You engaged in textbook elder abuse and fraud for financial gain. I didn't forge anything. Sarah's voice rose, panicked now. The doctor said Dad was fine, he signed the papers himself, I didn't. Dr. Raymond Foster, James interrupted, pulling out another document, who, according to the California Medical Board, had his license suspended 6 months ago for exactly this kind of misconduct, providing fraudulent capacity evaluations in exchange for payment, who, according to your boyfriend's bank records, received $15,000 from Marcus Brennan the day before your father signed that will. Marcus shot to his feet. That's a lie. You can't prove. Sit down, Mr. Brennan, James said coldly. We can prove everything. Bank transfers, email communications, phone records. You orchestrated a fraud, manipulated a vulnerable woman into betraying her dying father, and systematically looted an estate you had no legal right to. The room went silent. Sarah was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks, her hands covering her face. Marcus remained standing, looking toward the door like he was calculating escape routes. Westfield had his head in his hands. However, James continued, and something in his tone made everyone look up. The will itself is, strictly speaking, irrelevant to this proceeding. Sarah blinked through her tears, confused. What? The will governs Robert Whitmore's personal assets, James explained. But 95% of the properties, the commercial buildings, the residential units, the resort properties, were held in the family trust, not in Robert's individual name. The trust has its own governing provisions, established in 1995 and never modified. The will cannot override the trust. I saw understanding dawn in Sarah's eyes, followed immediately by terror. No, she whispered. No, that can't, the lawyer said. The lawyer, James said, looking at Westfield with undisguised contempt, was either incompetent or complicit. Perhaps both. Either way, the trust provisions are clear. And given the evidence of fraud and undue influence, I am invoking Section 12, Paragraph 7 of the trust agreement, the reversion clause. He slid another document across the table, this one official and notarized. Effective immediately, all properties held in the Whitmore family trust revert to Margaret Whitmore as sole trustee and primary beneficiary. Additionally, Sarah Whitmore is liable for treble damages for any assets sold or encumbered, plus all legal costs incurred in this investigation. Treble damages, Gerald added helpfully, means 3 times the value of every property you sold or borrowed against. By our calculation, that's approximately $47 million you now owe your mother. Sarah made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. I don't have $47 million. I spent it. On the house and the cars and investments, and she turned to Marcus, desperate. Tell them we can fix this. But Marcus was already moving toward the door, actually running, like the coward he was, abandoning Sarah the moment the consequences became real. Security, James said calmly into his phone. Don't let the gentleman in the gray suit leave the building. Law enforcement is on their way. Because Gerald and I had decided, in the end, that mercy without justice was just enabling. That letting them walk away would teach them nothing except that betrayal carried no real consequences. So we'd filed criminal complaints, and right now, 2 floors down, FBI agents specializing in elder fraud were waiting to make arrests. Sarah was sobbing now, great heaving gasps that shook her whole body. Mom, she choked out. Mom, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean, he made me. I was scared. I looked at my daughter across that conference table, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. But something softer than the rage I'd carried for 3 weeks. Something that remembered her as a child, before greed and fear and a smooth-talking con man had twisted her into someone I didn't recognize. You cut me out, I said quietly. While your father was dying, you looked at me and decided I was disposable. That 52 years of marriage and sacrifice and love meant less than getting your inheritance early. I was wrong, she sobbed. I know I was wrong. Please. Please don't let them arrest me. I'll pay you back, I'll work, I'll do anything. You'll face consequences, I said. Real ones. Because that's what happens when you betray the people who loved you. But Sarah. I paused, surprised by what I was about to say. After you've faced those consequences, after you've served whatever sentence the court gives you, after you've understood what you did and who you hurt. If you want to rebuild, if you want to earn back even a fraction of what you've lost, I won't close that door completely. Her eyes widened, desperate hope flickering through the tears. But you'll have to earn it, I continued. Every bit of it. The way your father and I earned everything we had. Through work, through sacrifice, through proving you're someone worthy of a second chance. And it starts with telling the truth, all of it, to the investigators who are about to walk through that door. The FBI agents arrived 3 minutes later. They were professional and efficient, reading Marcus and Sarah their rights while Westfield sat frozen in his chair, probably calculating his own legal exposure. Sarah was still crying as they led her away, but she looked back at me once, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen in years. Remorse. Real, genuine remorse. Maybe it wouldn't last. Maybe prison would harden her, or she'd find a way to blame me for everything, to rewrite history so she was the victim. But maybe, just maybe, hitting rock bottom would crack open whatever shell of entitlement had calcified around her heart. I left San Francisco that afternoon with every property deed back in my name, with justice in motion, and with something I hadn't expected to feel: peace. Not the peace of forgetting or forgiving, but the peace of standing up for myself, of refusing to be cast aside, of honoring Robert's memory by protecting what we'd built together. The house felt different when I returned. Not temporary anymore, not borrowed. Mine again. Ours. I walked through rooms Robert and I had chosen together, past photographs of our life, and felt his presence in the evening light slanting through windows. I'm 83 now, and I've learned that happy endings aren't always neat. Sarah is serving a reduced sentence, 3 years, in exchange for her cooperation against Marcus, who got 8. Westfield was disbarred. The properties are stable and profitable again, managed by people who actually understand real estate instead of just seeing dollar signs. And me? I'm learning to live in a house that feels too big now, too empty, but also full of memories that no one can steal. Some days I still reach for Robert's coffee mug. Some days I still hear Sarah's childhood laughter echoing through rooms she hasn't visited in over a year. But I survived. That's what I want you to understand, if you're listening to this story and seeing pieces of your own life reflected back. You can survive betrayal, even by the people you love most. You can stand up for yourself even when you're tired and grieving and afraid. You can demand justice and still leave room for redemption. It's never too late to reclaim your worth. Never too late to say no to being diminished. Never too late to honor the life you built, and the person you loved and the strength you didn't know you had until you needed it most. Robert would be proud of me. And finally, after everything, I'm proud of myself too.